right. Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Adam Mathews. We are talking with Emily Kouba, who's one of our therapists at Mathews Counseling. And we are just kind of breaking down some ideas that we have that we're putting on our blog. And Emily wrote one about a really hard topic. It's about grief, right? What made you want to write about grief and talk about this? It's just a really hard concept, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, grief came to mind because I have worked with several people who have sought out therapy after losing a loved one to death,
Mhm.
after going through a divorce, after losing something else that's significant and important in their lives, whether or not it's actual death, but it's loss.
Yeah. Mm.
Um, and working with them on, what do you do next, right? That's the big
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, what do you do next after this loss? And I love that you mentioned too that it's not just losing somebody that equates to a loss, right? Can you give some examples? Like what are some things your clients come in that are loss type stuff that's still grief work that I don't know that many people think of it as grief work when they're talking about loss. Do you have examples of things that people come in and talk about
Sure.
that are?
Certainly the loss of a relationship. So this can
Mm,
be when a marriage ends. You're not only
yeah,
grieving losing that person, but you're grieving the idea of this future that you guys have planned
yeah,
together. So that's a lot
yeah,
to let go of.
yeah,
Um,
100%.
yeah.
Yeah, I think there's in terms of too, like I've seen clients where even moving away from their childhood hometown is a big loss. And the ideas of anytime there's something that is not, particularly in the course of life, doesn't go the way that you planned it or expected, you're losing this ideal version. You're talking about that, right? Divorce, right, is a big one. The loss of a career that you thought you could have, injuries like the disabilities, accidents that happen, right, that result in disabilities, like those type of things are really like you're, in a lot of sense, you're losing this ideal future that you have for yourself, which can be a loss, right? Um, so when you think about the idea of what do you do next, right? What comes after, right? What are the big things to you that are really important to note about this idea of grief and loss?
The biggest thing that I tell anyone who I work with on these issues is that there is not an all size fits all prescription
Mm,
for what it feels like to lose something.
yeah,
So a lot of people are familiar with the 5 stages of grief, and we've really used that as a prescriptive measure of what to expect and when it's going
yeah,
to be over. And that's
yeah,
just a fallacy. That's not usually how it goes. Um,
yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
that you're gonna do these five things, and it's, you can check them almost like you could check them off a checklist, and then the grieving is
Mhm.
done, right? Yeah, that's kind of the five stages has dominated, grief thought for a really, really long time, and it's not all that has it can be helpful, but it's not always helpful to think about that because then we're thinking everybody's going to do this the exact same way, right? Yeah. So
Absolutely.
so what do you think what's a better way, like when you're thinking about that, you're saying there's not one right way to grieve and what wrong way to grieve, right? Is that accurate? What I'm hearing?
Yeah, there's not a okay, I'm failing at getting better because I don't
Mm,
feel like I'm out of the denial stage by the agreed upon length of time. And
yeah.
really, grief is going to look differently for everyone and it's going to change quite often. So you might feel like you're in denial one week and you think
Hmm.
you're past it, and the next week you start over and you're in that same
Yeah.
place, but that doesn't mean that you're failing. It's just kind of the natural process.
Yeah. That idea that we get a pass fail on our grieving process, rather it's just what's happening at the time. What do you think when that idea clicks for people and you notice it click for people, that idea that it's not a right or wrong way, or it's not a do this and then it's okay type of thing. When that clicks for them, what happens? What is that? I don't know, if I'm your client and that light bulb happens for me, right? What kind of things does that bring to me that is helpful with the grieving process?
Well, it gives you permission to feel what you're feeling
Uh,
first and foremost.
yeah.
frees you from feeling any sort of guilt or sense of failure or any sense of needing to push down whatever's coming up for you that day.
Mm,
So I tell folks, if you wake up and you really feel like, gosh, I'm going to cry. I'm going to cry all day. I know it's going to happen. I feel immense sadness today. I tell them, do it. Cry.
yeah.
Let it be a grief day. We label them even sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that idea of permission. It gives you permission to whatever, and it sounds like to me, and tell me if I'm wrong in this, but whatever is happening that day, that's okay, right? You're giving permission to it's like what's coming up, like what are we feeling, what's happening. I sometimes even talk about it today is like if you can sit down and cry, that's great, but if you can't, that's okay as well, right? If you have to get on with your day, or you have to like go to work, right? Or go deal with your kids, like whatever is happening in that moment, I think that gives some really great permission to that, and that's wonderful. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. So in that, when I'm starting to feel that permission some more, and I stop thinking about it as kind of that pass fail type of scenario, what do I do next? Like what happens then? Like what am I able to do? What can I? How do I? I don't know. How do I grieve well? I guess is like would be my
Yeah.
question. Like is that a if I can even ask that question in that way, right?
Yeah, definitely. So, um, lean into the coping skills that have always worked for you. You don't have to reinvent the wheel when it's like, okay, now I'm grieving. So I need to go to a
Hmm.
support group and share my story because that's what people who grieve do. And that's going to
Yeah.
make me feel better. Some people might, right? Sharing our stories, that'll
Yeah.
help. But for some people, if it feels better to keep going to my yoga class because that really settles me,
Yeah.
that really centers me,
Yeah.
then do that. Talk to a friend, do all of the things that typically have always made you
Yeah.
feel better.
Yeah. Even if that includes eating the biggest bowl of Fruity Pebbles that I can at 10 o'clock at night, like you're telling me that that's okay, that I can continue to do that, right?
Yeah, I'm going to
Okay.
not comment on that.
No, I think that's great. I think like there are things like that that we naturally do that grief can sometimes get us away from, right? That can be like this is yoga's a great one because I love doing yoga, but I find that sometimes it's hard. It's hard to get up and go do it, especially when I'm grieving or I'm sad or something's coming up for me. But I also find that when I do that, that's often because that's something I normally do. It all often is something that's incredibly helpful, and there's tons of things. There are tons
Right.
of things like that, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, often I have folks say, I don't want to distract myself or throw myself into an activity that typically helps
Mm,
because I feel like I'm running away from my grief or I'm avoiding it. And while sometimes maybe that's true, I really
yeah.
encourage people to embrace, the power and the helpfulness of distraction and compartmentalization. That
Hmm.
sometimes, our bodies and our minds are helping to protect us by saying,
Hmm.
I can't focus or give all my energy right now to this grief.
Yeah.
I'm going to put it somewhere else for the next hour or two, and that's really going to serve
Yeah.
me.
No, that's good. I think yeah, I think that's a good distinction because it's only distraction if I'm not dealing with what's happening in the moment, right?
Mhm.
If I'm making that conscious choice of saying, you know what, I can't sit here and cry right now. I can't, be reflective right now. I can't kind of the sadness is too much for me right now. I'm making a conscious choice, right, of saying, okay, I'm going to go and do this instead and put my energy in this direction. I think that distinction is really helpful because we do get that confused of like, oh, I can't do anything that I normally would, or I can't do anything, and because that means distraction, which it can if I'm not kind of if it's not that conscious decision that I'm making and that I'm choosing in that moment, right? That's
Right,
really
absolutely.
good. What do you think? Last question for you, just about this. What's the goal of grief? Like, if you like, were just thinking about like, what does grief help us do? What does it help us move toward? If we're moving through it, like, what's the goal of it? Does that make sense as a question? Like, do you have a thought there about that?
Yeah, it's definitely a layered question. So I'll do my best
Yeah.
to answer it. But grief, typically, we're trying to make sense of what happens to us, right? And that
Mm,
not only applies to grief, but that applies to all sorts of stories we tell ourselves. But when
mm,
we lose something or someone that's so important to us, if we just ignore that, we push it down, we don't give credence to what we're feeling, that's never going to feel quite resolved, right? And it's never going to
mm,
make sense. It's going to feel like it
yeah.
happened for a senseless reason. So we allow ourselves to grieve, not so that we forget the person or the thing, but that
Mm.
we still are able to live our lives as fully as we possibly can in their absence.
Yeah, yeah, I love that idea of making sense of it and being allowing us to then begin to engage with life in a new and a different way with an appreciation for what that person or that thing that we lost was, right? But it allows us to move through that so that we can continue to live into the life that we have, right? Yeah, I love that. It's a really complicated, obviously this isn't everything about grief. This is kind of just a short little snippet of ideas that we hope are helpful for folks. But it's a very, because it's such a big idea and a big topic, it can be hard sometimes to talk about. But I like the way that you're talking about it and engaging with it and moving forward can be really helpful there. So thanks for your time, Emily, and thanks for all these thoughts about grief.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.